everyone, welcome back. My name's Diana. This is my channel Bookish Di, and I'm here to finally wrap up my February reading. So I read 7 books this past month, and for the most part, I enjoyed what I read. There was one book that I didn't really like. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I go through my wrap up. For the most part, it was a decently solid month of reading. So the first book I read in February was Into the Dark by Claudia Gray. It is yet another Star Wars: The High Republic novel. This is their YA entry, and it centers on a jumble of characters. So we have Reith, who is a Jedi Padawan who doesn't want to go out to the frontier. He wants to stay in the archives and be a scholar. We have Afi, who is the heir to a shipping guild, and we have Leox, who is a pilot, his navigator Geode, who is great, as well as some other Jedi. I promise I'm going to be recording my Star Wars: The High Republic wrap-up with this and the other 2 entries, but overall, I really enjoyed this book. I thought Claudia Gray worked her usual magic. It had a really great cast of characters that you cared about. It did a good job of setting up some stakes, both in the context of this work as well as the larger publishing initiative. And I thought that it did a good job of fleshing out the characters. That was something I had talked about with Light of the Jedi, where it felt like there were too many characters and they didn't get enough development. And I thought that despite having a larger cast of characters than Test of Courage, this book did a very good job of establishing who the characters are, what they care about, what they're afraid of. And I also really appreciated that we have a canon ace character in Leox. It made me really happy when he was just talking about his asexuality, and I'm going to be forever grateful for Claudia Gray for giving us a canon ace rep. So I gave this about 4 stars out of 5, and again, would highly recommend it. The second book that I read in February was They All Fall Down by Rachel Housel Hall, and this honestly was my least favorite book that I read this month. So this book is premised on this woman, Miriam, who, as we discover throughout the course of the book, is involved in a cyberbullying case of a dancer the same age as her daughter. And she gets invited to what she thinks is a reality show where she's going to earn some money and kind of redeem herself in the eyes of the public. And she goes down to Mexico, to Baja California, and she meets the other people who initially she thinks are going to be on this TV show with her, but it turns out that they were actually brought together by their mutual lawyer, who is now dead, and he has said that he was going to have the will read and give them money. And if this sounds similar to And Then There Were None by and then they start dying. And if this sounds similar to And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, you're right. It's definitely a spin inspired by that classic mystery story, but I don't think it really worked for me. And the main reason is that I think for something like this, you do need to have an element of you like the character. You have some sort of empathy for the character, even though you know that they're terrible people. And I don't think that really worked here. I think that Miriam is established as really unlikable early on, and it was really hard to root for her. All the other characters are established as really unlikable, and it also, I thought, didn't necessarily stick the landing. And just some small spoilers. One of the things with And Then There Were None is that the mastermind is among them, and part of the terror is trying to find out, who is killing everyone off. And you don't get that sense in this book. Like, it wasn't necessarily like there is a killer among us. It just read initially as these are all random accidents. And it didn't work for me. I wasn't really, I ended up finishing it, obviously, but it was kind of a stinker, and it kind of put me off from reading anything else by this author, which is sad because they do have some mystery novels that do seem more up my alley, but I wasn't impressed with the writing with this one. I ended up giving this about like a 2.5 out of, like 2.5, 2.75 out of 3. Like, I did not like this book. I did not think it was well done. The third book that I read in February was Wife of the Gods by Quay Cordy. This is the first book in the Darko Dawson detective series, and I really enjoyed it. It is set in Ghana, and it follows Detective Darko Dawson, who is assigned by his superiors to go investigate the death of a young female medical student in a rural part of Ghana. And this area, Dawson has a personal tie to. His mother was originally from the area, and she disappeared when he was, I believe, 9. And so that disappearance has haunted him throughout his life. It's part of the reason he became a detective. Luke, say hi. It's part of the reason he became a detective, because the detective who initially was looking into his mother's case started mentoring him. And Dawson goes to this village and he finds this interplay of tradition versus modernity. He finds a lot of personal interactions between who the suspects are. And I thought this was really well done. I thought that the eventual solution to the mystery was seeded throughout the story fairly well. So it wasn't necessarily a surprise when the real killer was revealed. And I thought that the author did a good job with that. My one kind of nibble with that is it did feel like there were too many red herrings. There were too many false roads that Dawson went down. And I thought that there were times it felt like the clash between tradition versus modernity was there more for just making it seem not an American mystery. But I thought that it was very interesting. I thought that the characters were, Dawson and his family were really well done. I like that Dawson wasn't necessarily a traditional like macho alpha male hero. He has anger issues, but he also cares so much for his family and those he considers under his protection. And yeah, I enjoyed this book. I'm definitely interested in picking up the next book in the series, and I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. The fourth book that I read this month was Lakewood by Megan Giddings, and I had listened to it on audiobook, which I highly recommend. I really enjoyed the audiobook narrator. And I cannot remember for the life, I can't remember the name of the audiobook narrator, so I'll put it in the description below. But this book is a medical thriller with a little bit of a speculative edge to it. So the book is centered on a young Black college student named Lena Johnson, and her grandmother dies. And once her grandmother dies, she becomes responsible for the medical debt of her mother, the debt for the care of her grandmother, other debts that they have. And Lena is trying to find a way to pay these bills, to continue getting care for her mother, who is sick with an unnamed disease. And she gets approached by this research company called, under the guise of Great Lakes Shipping, who recruit her into this research project. And she's under strict non-disclosure agreements. There's body horror, so content warning for body horror, medical abuse, death, loss of teeth. I highly recommend checking out the content warnings on the Storygraph because they do a good job of giving you a sense of what's in here. But basically there's medical experimentation, and similar to Wife of the Gods, I really enjoyed this book. I thought that Lena was a very interesting character because there's so much responsibility placed on her by her grandmother. There's responsibility placed on her like as the first in her family to go to college. And there's a lot of discussion about race and class, and how someone like Lena, who is a poor Black woman, is set up to be is someone who the white upper class medical system views as exploitable and disposable. And this book really goes into the experiments done on Lena, as well as the systems that allow those experiments to be conducted and tolerated, because it's very heavily implied that the town where Lena is living knows that there is something going on with these young people of color who go into the town, but no one really does anything. It is dark. It does end on a kind of hopeful note. My one main complaint is I do think the ending was a little rushed. I would have liked a little bit more leading up to the final denouement, but I thought that the writing was really good. It was very introspective at times. I thought it did a good job of exploring race and class, and I gave this about 4.25 stars out of 5 stars. But again, please check the Storygraph content ratings because there are a lot here. Like I had said, medical abuse, loss of teeth, death, forced experimentation, among other things. The 5th book that I read in February was Four Lost Cities, A Secret History of the Urban Age by Annalee Newitz. This is their newest nonfiction book that was published this year, and it explores 4 cities that were abandoned over time. There's Çatalhöyük in Turkey, there's Pompeii in modern-day Italy, there's Angkor Wat in present-day Cambodia, and then there's Cahokia in present-day United States. And throughout this book, there are 4 sections, about 3 chapters each. Newitz goes to the sites. They talk to archaeologists and historians who specialize in those particular areas and talk about how life was in those cities, and then why these cities may have been abandoned, and the different reasons that people abandon cities or people leave cities. And for all of them, one of the things that came up that was, aside from Pompeii, which was kind of a special circumstance, all of these cities, the other 3 cities, it wasn't just a sudden abandonment. It was more of a gradual people leaving these cities over time, which is something that we're currently seeing in the United States, in cities in the Rust Belt, for example, where over the last few decades, you've seen people leave those cities for a variety of reasons. They also discuss in the book the different systems in place, as well as how we interpret those cities, and talking about how modern day sensibilities influence how we interpret the abandonment, how people live, as well as talking a bit about the whole discovering a lost city that definitely came into play with Angkor Wat. I thought this book did a very good job at what it set out to do, but it was also a little too short for me. I thought I would have been interested in it being a bit longer. It was very surface level, and then there was only really one epilogue that kind of tied everything together, and I think there definitely could have been a longer section talking about the lessons learned or talking about the similarities between the cities and what we can learn today. But instead we just got this very short epilogue, and I didn't think that was necessarily enough to really nail what Newitz was trying to accomplish in this book. And that was a little disappointing. I really was hoping for more in-depth conversation about what these 4 cities and their eventual abandonment show us, or talking about how we're seeing it play out more and more in the modern age. And yeah, the ending I took away a half star for this. I gave it a 3.5 out of 4. If you like history, I would recommend reading it, but it's not something I necessarily think I'll go back to. For me, the most interesting part was the part of the Pompeii chapter, because we think of it as, this explosion happened, the city got buried in ash, a lot of people died, but instead it became more of a refugee and resettlement story, in that there were people who had fled beforehand, and what happened to them, where did they go? And then there's this element that Newitz talks about in the last chapter of the Pompeii section how after Pompeii exploded, there was this culture of silence around the event, similar to the culture of silence around the 1918 flu pandemic, which I touched on in my Best of 2020 with Pale Rider. And I thought that was interesting, especially given current events with the pandemic and how people are talking about how will this be remembered? Will people just not talk about it, similar to the 1918 flu? How will people move forward from it? So I did think that part was very interesting, but overall it was a fine book. Not my favorite, it was fine. The sixth book that I read in February was another nonfiction book. It was We Keep the Dead Close, A Murder at Harvard and a Half Century of Silence by Becky Cooper. And so this book, it really felt like two books crammed into one. So the main premise of this book is that when Becky Cooper was at Harvard for undergrad, she heard a story about how a professor had murdered a graduate student because he was having an affair with her. And then she discovers the actual story where it was this graduate student, Jane Britton, who was murdered in her apartment, and they never caught the murderer. And so Becky Cooper becomes obsessed with this case. She starts looking into it, interviewing Jane's mentors and colleagues and friends and trying to, get a sense of who Jane was and who might have killed her. And that was the one book in this, out of the two books, I thought that was honestly the least interesting. It was just kind of another dead white girl story. But the other book, which I thought was much more interesting and I actually wish had been the central focus, was talking about why the story has preserved and what does it tell us about gender and academia, particularly at an institution like Harvard that's so old and has its own way of awarding tenure and of granting seniority. And I thought that was a much more interesting book, especially given that I am currently in academia. I am considered tenure track. And I thought that discussion about how academia reinforces its racist and sexist hierarchy was much more interesting. I thought that the discussions about how Harvard's system works and how it protects people who abuse their power over students or younger professors was much more interesting. And I thought that was a stronger book. And I really wish we had gotten that book instead, because honestly, I'm not gonna lie, the part about Jane Britton it wasn't that interesting to me. It was your average true crime dead white girl story that I don't think would have been published except for the fact that it was centered at Harvard. It was fine. So I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend the audiobook. It's narrated by Cooper. It's very long, and I don't think Cooper's a very good narrator. So I'm not quite sure if I would recommend this book. And like I said, I wish we had gotten the deep dive into Harvard's structures that instead. So the last book that I read in February was Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor. This is her new novella from Tor.com. And it centers on a young girl who lives in Ghana who gains powers and forgets her name, and she's looking for the artifact that she thinks granted her powers. And so this is a very quiet and introspective story about Sankofa, who, like I said, is kind of wandering with her fox companion, trying to find the object and the connections she makes along the way. And I really enjoyed it. It's not, like I said, it's very introspective. It's very character focused. There's not much of a plot, but if you like Okorafor's writing, which I really do, if you like more introspective stories that have a speculative element, this is set in near future Ghana. There's a lot of talk about robots and AI and corporations, but those are kind of secondary focus to Sankofa's journey. then I would recommend this book. It was very lovely. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And it's another good book from Okorafor for me. She has become one of my favorite authors. I really enjoyed everything I've read from her so far, and she's become one of those auto-buy authors for me. So that is my February in books. For the most part, pretty good. I would say I enjoyed a lot of the books that I read aside from They All Fall Down. So I guess, have you read any of the books that I talked about today? Do any of them sound interesting? Let me know in the comments. If you like what you see, please like and subscribe, and I will hopefully have another video up in the nearest future talking about Star Wars: The High Republic. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.